Yeah, so let's kick off our payments panel. I'm really excited to welcome Balaji Srinivasan, CEO of 21, Elizabeth Stark, CEO of Lightning Labs, and Ryan Charles, CEO of Yours. I want to dive right in with maybe a little bit of a controversial question. Why use cryptocurrency at all for payments? We've seen it used for speculation, obviously, perhaps for store of value. But what's your case as to why would we use cryptocurrency versus a Venmo or a PayPal solution? Just very briefly, whoever.
Sure. Well, so like a few years ago, I had this tweet which said that digital currency was good for transactions that are very large, very small, very fast, very international, and/or very automated. I think most of those hold up other than very small, basically because of the whole fee thing over the last couple of years. I think very small will come back. There will be chains and there will be ways that we can do that. I think there's a few really critical aspects of that, and there's maybe a sixth, which is for people who are very unbanked, and that applies not just to folks in the developing world where it's normally talked about, but right now there's a major hole on the internet where you can go and put your credit card into a website, but most people don't put their bank account in a website to get paid. The ability to spin up a new address and get paid very rapidly without actually setting up a bank account is something that's a major advantage of digital currency. I think that's one of the biggest advantages of it from a payment standpoint.
Well, so Balaji actually, I think, has talked about this quite a bit, but in the early days of the internet, the kind of creators of a lot of the protocols envisioned that there would be this payment layer and this value layer. And a lot of these problems just hadn't been solved yet. There were these concepts of Xiaomi and eCash, but you had to trust a certain type of intermediary. But why is it that we can send, say, an animated GIF or easily, send somebody an MP3, but you can't just send value to somebody regardless of what application you're using in an interoperable protocol, right? So if I log on to Venmo, then Venmo can block my transactions. I actually recently went over the Venmo limit. It was really annoying. I had to wait a week to be able to send money again. So with cryptocurrencies, you take all of these problems away, and you can have a native currency and a native value layer for the internet. And I think a lot of people like to talk about buying coffee in the Bitcoin world. It's like this meme, right? It's not that hard to buy coffee right now. But I do believe that what these technologies and currencies will do is it'll enable use cases that weren't previously possible because you just couldn't send one cent 1,000,000 times per second, for example, for a machine API call or to access a mesh network.
So we have two primary reasons for using cryptocurrency. Number one is, and I'll just sort of come back at what Balaji said, you can do small value payments if you have an L2. So one of the things that we've done is to build, similar to the Lightning Network, ours isn't quite as advanced, at least at a protocol level, but at a sort of web technologies level, ours is very, very good. It's very usable for our users. We're able to lower fees very, very, very low. Although if you watch my other talk, the fees on Bitcoin have gotten so high that actually we decided to switch to Litecoin after all because that makes the fees even lower. So number one is with an L2 you can have quite low fees. Number two is regulatory. So from our point of view as a business, we would rather not be a custodian of our users' funds. That's not what we're doing. We're not a bank. We're not a payment processor. If we can not be in the business of being a custodian, we would prefer that. So by using cryptocurrency, our users possess their own private keys and their HTLC pre-images and revocation pre-images. So they have their money. We can't access their funds, only they can. When they send money to another user, we never have access to it. Only the other user has access to it. So this, for legal reasons, I'm sort of skipping over why that's true, but being a custodian versus not being a custodian makes a big difference legally. We're just a software company. So those are the two reasons. Low fees, if you're willing to go through all the pain of doing it right now. When Lightning rolls out, I think it'll be easier. And then regulatory.
Yeah, those answers make a lot of sense to me. And the reason why I wanted to ask the question was to have it be a little bit of a leading question because Bitcoin transaction fees really have shot up, right? We've seen transaction fees average $1, $1.50, maybe even $2 at peak times. And so I wanted to segue into the activation of Segwit. And because that has been, the subject of this scaling war. I bet a lot of people in the audience maybe feel some exhaustion because of that. So I feel curious to hear, maybe from each of you, activation of Segwit, either on Bitcoin or Litecoin. Does that change anything for you at all? Does it make things easier? Does it allow you to roll out things that you had been planning? Just give us your thoughts.
I mean, it's good to see that it's activated. I think that even with Segwit, though, right now, there's a lot of other options for doing payments if you want to do payments. And it's not obvious that you want to, like, I'm still extremely bullish on Bitcoin as an investment. I think that as an investment and as like an innovation, it's still a huge thing. As a technology platform to build on top of it, it may or may not be the best thing to build on top of. And I think that, we now have the network effect, has been broken in the sense that you do have, Ethereum coming up, you have all these other coins going up, there's this explosion of coins across the space, and it may be the case that each of those does something a little bit better than Bitcoin. For example, Zcash with, privacy, or Ethereum with programmability, and there may be something else that is just optimized for really small payments, right? So I'd say that really it's good that Segwit is out there, but I don't consider it like the be all and end all. We now have a lot of things to look at.
So being involved in the Bitcoin community is kind of like living in a dystopian cyberpunk novel. That's what I feel like my life has been like for the past year or two, for those that have been involved. And people love to fight. And there's kind of this law that any Bitcoin discussion will ultimately evolve into a block-sized debate, right? For those that are familiar with
Godwin's law.
Exactly. So from our standpoint, at Lightning Labs, we're building an implementation of the Lightning Network called Lightning Network Daemon, LND for short. And it was a big deal for us because segregated witness was a core part of our implementation and our technology. It was possible to build out Lightning without it. In fact, Bitfury recently forked our code to do just that. But it was far less optimal. And it's like when you're building a protocol, you want to build the best technology you can, not build something that's inferior. And that's because Segwit brought what's called a malleability fix to Bitcoin. So there was a lot of uncertainty. We didn't know, was it going to activate at all this year? What was going to happen on August 1st with the potential chain split of BIP 148, the UASF, or one type of UASF. But once BIP 91, which is one of the activation methods, did finally lock in, we actually did get some champagne with our team, Brian and Lalo, who are here in the audience. So that was a big celebration point for us because we'd really worked hard to build out our technology, which uses Segwit. So now, I believe later in August, we don't know the exact date, but something like in the 20s, it'll finally activate on the main Bitcoin chain. Also, Litecoin had Segwit earlier, and that was a big deal for them. They're actually doing some good work around what's called masked and Schnorr signatures. So they're kind of moving ahead with changes that Bitcoin can make. So for you guys building on Litecoin, that could be advantageous. So from our standpoint, it's a big deal. This means that we can finally get Lightning out to the world in the wild and make it the best protocol it can be.
So from our point of view, we made a decision early last year when we started working on our payment channel technology not to rely on Segwit. Segwit existed as an idea. I think it might have been implemented at that time. I'm trying to remember. But it certainly wasn't live. And so we decided we would rather not be dependent on some technology that may or may not ever happen. So we designed all of our payment channel technology in a way that we don't need Segwit. So we were able to make our technology work on Bitcoin. We announced that we had a sort of routed micropayment as of several months ago on Bitcoin. That was sort of before we had to make our switch to Litecoin and launch our alpha product. So Segwit doesn't make a huge difference to us just because we went out of our way to not be dependent on Segwit. I'll also sort of take a bit of a contrarian point just because, we are, I'll say that we are, I guess you could say, ambivalent towards Segwit. Segwit is okay, but we think that there's a really big problem with Bitcoin right now, which is, well, fees are really high, and Segwit at best will not change that. I mean, I don't see any hope that Segwit is actually going to lower fees on Bitcoin. I think realistically what's going to happen is Bitcoin's going to keep growing modestly, and the fees are probably going to stay approximately the same or increase. Now, we've seen a bit of a decrease recently, but it's still extremely high by historical standards. So we are passionate supporters of on-chain scaling. We think the most important thing that needs to happen on Bitcoin right now is a radical increase to the block size.
My law. It's not actually my law.
So Segwit is all right. I don't mean to downplay it. It's really cool technology, but it's not what I think or what we think as a business needs to happen on Bitcoin right now.
Thanks for sharing your point of view. So I want to touch next on transaction clearing in the space. And the way I see things, roughly organized now is that we have the miners who do on-chain transactions processing and then get a fee from that. And then on the other hand, we have maybe what has been described during the day as kind of like the cloud-based services, the exchanges that do internally transaction settlement and then finally maybe settle it on the blockchain or something. So I'm just wondering, what is your take on payment channels, whether that can somehow disrupt this ecosystem? Could it change the power balance? Are miners going to have to cede some power to people running Lightning nodes or other types of payment channels? Just curious about your views.
Yeah, so we actually did go pretty far down the path and implemented payment channels and so on in Bitcoin. And the issue though was that because neither Segwit nor the block size got through for a very long time, the amount that you need to deposit to open a payment channel is very high relative to the amount of the payment. So they're just infeasible, priced out of a lot of things because you don't want to deposit $5 to make 1 cent or fractions of a cent in payments. You don't want to pay $1.50 to make in transaction fees for something like that. So the issue with payment channels has always been the problem of putting down a slow, large deposit. Slow because it takes a random amount of time to get confirmed. Large because it's very large relative to the transaction size. And people can say, oh, you put up one deposit, but it's kind of like people who used to say, oh, Java's fast, if you take away the amortization time for it to boot up, right? But in many applications, that time at the beginning is actually very important, and having someone just executes right off the bat is important. So I've seen other technologies actually that are different from payment channels that are promising for different kinds of micropayments use cases. And some have been published, some haven't been published. So I definitely don't think payment channels are the be all and end all. I mean, and we've gone pretty far down that path. They will be useful for some purposes though.
Do you mind naming some names of those other technologies?
We'll publish on it. It's okay.
Oh,
yeah, sure.
Interesting. Yeah. But so is what you're arguing that payment channels is not necessarily a great consumer-facing solution, but that it could serve a purpose on the institutional side?
I think it's good for certain kinds of purposes. Like basically, if you've got a model where you can tolerate a slow, large deposit relative to the amount of money that's being sent, yes, it'll work. For those that you cannot tolerate that, there are other kinds of things that one can do.
When you say slow, though, it takes 10 minutes for a confirmation typically in Bitcoin. So do you mean something that could be instant on-chain?
Yeah, exactly like it, right. Or something that's extremely fast relative to, for example, if you want to do an API call, you want to have millisecond latency. How can you achieve millisecond latency? Well, there's ways actually that one might be able to do that if that's a design goal from the beginning.
Got it. So when you're getting started, to be clear, to get onto Lightning, it takes an on-chain transaction, but once you're on, you can transact instantly.
Yes, that's right.
So you're saying to get started.
Yeah, because the issue is that whoever you're transacting with, either you're setting up a deposit with K parties, or you've got a hub and everybody's putting a deposit with that hub. And it may be the case that hubs grow large enough and central enough that that deposit time is just like booting up your computer and you do it once and you never have to do it again. Or you do it every 3 months. It's like a very long-running cookie. That is one model. However, the ability to just rapidly open and close a payment with somebody without a lot of overhead, I think is an important characteristic, and the design space is larger.
Yeah, so we actually, just with our team, we're chatting about ways where you could theoretically open what we're calling virtual channels. This is very preliminary, but there are some very cool things that could be done on top of Lightning in that regard. To get to your broader question around exchanges and custody, so one of the biggest risks in our industry is custodial exchanges, for example, where people that had money in Mt. Gox, what we just saw with BTCE, Bitfinex when it got hacked, people like to trade in the cryptocurrency industry, right? And there are a lot of these exchanges that are holding custody for others. And that can be a major risk. And then if those keys are compromised, as they have been in various times in the past, well, you lost your money. So one of the big things we're looking at building out with Lightning is a way to decentralize that custody, where you could have various parties that could hold their own keys and then still be able to, say, trade and transact, but not have to risk the fact that, well, if the exchange gets hacked, I lose my money.
Yeah, custody is a huge deal. Like, from my experience, there are no custodians in the space that have gotten insurance that matters, like insurance that is actually something real. And I think that really highlights the risks that we're talking about here. Brian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so it's interesting to think about the way our business works. So we're a social media company based on our technology is based on payment channels, so users can send money to each other. we take a portion of the money. And the way this works is we basically run a Lightning node. I use that word carefully just because our protocol is technically different, but it's very similar in spirit to the way a Lightning node works. So from that point of view, just on your sort of question, Tur, we do that as a business. There's a way you can do that. You can make a business on this. Theoretically, we're not earning very much money right now, but theoretically, we'll earn a lot of money from this in the future. A couple of comments I'd add to that, though, which are, you mentioned miners, Tur. So it is interesting to consider the implications of this from a miner point of view. Miners currently earn their money predominantly from the block reward. They earn less money from transaction fees. They're going to have to earn their money from transaction fees in the future, though, because the block reward gradually decreases to 0. So it's threatening from a miner point of view that people are going to work around the miners. This is maybe good if you don't like the miners. It's maybe bad if you like the security of the network and having miners earn money so they have an incentive to keep doing proof of work on the network. So I'll just leave that out there as sort of a consequence of this direction in Bitcoin, and it's hard to say how this will play out in practice, but I would say it is not necessarily good for the security of the blockchain.
Yeah, I've heard it mentioned earlier today that it could be, the theory is that it would be sort of a tragedy of the commons problem in the future if people kind of abandon the main chain and do everything in the second layers.
They won't, though, because if you're doing a large value transaction, like you can wait 10 minutes. Like if you're going to buy a house on the blockchain, you can wait. And regardless if it's Litecoin or Bitcoin or you're using Ether, when you have these high volume transactions, that's when you can go up to layer 2. But there's still going to be use cases for the base layer, undoubtedly.
One thing I was just going to say regarding it, I think it's definitely true that at a certain point mining rewards cut off. However, because the way the mining works, as long as the price is doing more than increasing 2x every 4 years, you have at least constant revenue, and it's doing much better than that. So you can, I think, work out the math. But even though the Bitcoin block reward has been having, the dollar value of that block reward has been rising. So it might be a very long time before the block reward is not significant enough, for transaction fees. And then we can sort of deal with that at 100 million or 1 billion users or what have you.
My next question is about, thanks by the way, this is great. My next question is about chains. Up until fairly recently, we had one dominant chain. People talked about the Bitcoin Dominance Index, which was in the 90s. So basically all cryptocurrencies added together, market cap, 90% of that was taken by Bitcoin. And that slowly declined, and then we had a big drop to 30%. Now we're up to close to 50% because of a huge altcoin rally. So I'm kind of curious, because my observation is that from a payments point of view, I don't really see evidence yet that other cryptocurrencies than Bitcoin are being used for payments. But I'm curious, what's your take on it, and how do you see the future? Are you preparing for a multi-chain future, or are you mostly building on Litecoin in the case of Charles, or Ryan, sorry, or in your cases? Just curious where you see things heading.
I think it's definitely going to be a multi-coin future. I think part of the concept of decentralization is don't put all your eggs in one basket, and that applies at the coin level as well as within a coin. So there's many currencies in the world. There's going to be many coins in the world. It was awesome. To be clear, I'm still bullish on Bitcoin. I still think it's going to get to maybe even $1 trillion. At a minimum, just competing with gold, and it's got the store of value application. But it is something where you've got things which are just specialized for different kinds of workloads. And just like there's different programming languages, there's different currencies, there's going to be lots of different chains for different purposes.
So the original Lightning white paper was geared toward Bitcoin, but even back then, we understood that it could work on other chains. So right now in LNG, we have multi-chain support, as we call it. And right now that's Litecoin and Bitcoin. Turns out Litecoin is very similar, as I'm sure you know, to Bitcoin, so it wasn't all that difficult to do so. But one of the things that we're really interested in is the concept of cross-chain atomic swaps, the ability to transact without counterparty risk in a decentralized manner between currencies. So you could foresee some really cool contracting functionalities where you could actually have swaps execute given certain conditions. And you could have different currencies, that would be used for different cases, depending upon what's going on.
Would it also increase auditability? So that you can auditability, so you can verify that the funds are actually there. Whereas if you hold your funds with an exchange,
Well, in this case, it would be, you would have custody at the endpoint. So the individual, it's not even an auditability question, like you have your own coins, right?
Good point.
But for example, let's say you want to do a swap to Zcash, and then you want to use, their shielded transactions. You could do interesting things that could go with the various functionalities of the currencies.
So I used to be a Bitcoin maximalist until early 2017. And what changed is, so when I say I was a Bitcoin maximalist, I thought, well, gosh, what's the point in any of these altcoins? They don't seem to have any purpose. We only need one internet money. We don't need 1,000 of them. How irritating is that we have all these different cryptocurrencies? That's really annoying. Can't be good for the users, and also money has a strong network effect. But what happened is Bitcoin stopped working for a lot of people, including ourselves. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs saw opportunities here. They saw opportunities to fill needs that weren't being met by Bitcoin, and they saw it before Bitcoin hit a wall. And so they were well prepared for this issue in Bitcoin to start taking, advantage of this opportunity to create, if not businesses, I don't know what you'd call these things, but let's call them projects, I suppose. So I think we're well into that era. I had to reconcile with the fact that I was wrong because I was a Bitcoin maximalist, for something like almost 6 years. And I think the reality is we are definitely entering a multi-currency world, but I wouldn't count Bitcoin out yet. I think there are a lot of reasons why it's extremely useful to people to have one dominant blockchain, or to put it economically, one dominant money. I think money has a strong network effect. I think it is irritating for users to have to deal with all these different cryptocurrencies. And I think the reality is, as of today, although there are a lot more cryptocurrencies that have a lot more value than they used to, it's still the case that Bitcoin is the de facto reserve currency of this industry. And I see that continuing for the foreseeable future.
It's funny, I was just going to comment about when you have these swaps, you would go through Bitcoin to get to other currencies, and Bitcoin would still be kind of the exactly reserve currency of all the trading as well. And to be clear, we're big believers in the future of Bitcoin, so we're not ditching it by any means.
Thanks for your thoughts. I'm curious about just going forward again. What are your thoughts on the biggest driver on the one hand and the biggest challenge for cryptocurrencies in, say, the next 2 years?
Biggest driver is probably going to be tokenization. I think that tokenization, like actually Ryan made a comment about, are they businesses, are they projects? Dorsey actually made a comment a few years ago, which is the reason he did Twitter was that a U.S. headquartered Delaware C Corp was the best vehicle for him to achieve the ambition that he wanted to achieve. That may have changed, right? Like, if I was 20-something, I would never again start a company in the United States of America. I would only do things pure blockchain. The reason is because, it's immature today, but it's going to improve very rapidly. And tokenization removes the last hook to the United States, right? Like Sand Hill Road and Wall Street, like where the company begins and ends, have had a gravitational pull. And everyone said, oh, where's the next Silicon Valley? Is it this country? Is it that country? No, the next Silicon Valley is in the cloud, right? And we've actually put all the pieces up there already. We put Slack up there, and we put Gmail up there, and we have, Uber and Airbnb, so you can get around. Your cars in the cloud, your house is in the cloud, et cetera. You can just rent it on demand. Everything else can be pulled on demand. The one thing that couldn't be was funding. And so you had entrepreneurs from India and Israel and other places that would try to make the pilgrimage to Sand Hill to raise money, and it's very inorganic to do that. And then if they did raise money, then folks wouldn't want to go and fly out to the UK or Israel or what have you, so they'd be forced to headquarter here. And so that led to this kind of starting up network effect, right? Now that's been broken and you can raise from anywhere in the world, given obviously being compliant with all relevant laws in your jurisdiction, I think you're going to see a rapid decentralization of technology out of the United States, and I think you're going to see tokenization be like a buzzword that you see 10,000 times, like virtualization was in the early 2000s.
And then, do you have thoughts on the challenge, the biggest challenge?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, so I think, the challenge is going to be it's very, very technically challenging to build decentralized systems. They're just hard. They're because since they're spread out, you can't just push an update. If you think about how hard it can be to just keep a single server running, right? We need to rethink everything that we've done for reliability, robustness, updates, failover, load balancing, blah, 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 you name it, for decentralized systems where the folks may not even want to pull an update locally because it's not in their incentive to do so, or their incentives aren't aligned. So just a gigantic amount of computer science, game theory, and so on has to happen. I think it will. but it's hard. And I think the second aspect, of course, is security. It's just not easy to program these systems when you've got tens of millions of dollars at stake. Even Gavin Wood had that parity bug, so who else can do it, right?
Yeah, it reminds me of what Bram Cohen said earlier, is that it's so incredibly hard to build something robust and that you really need to focus and maybe even get it wrong for 3 years until you finally launch your protocol.
Yeah, I think a very good model is something that we call progressive decentralization, just like progressive web development, where you'll render a page based on browser support, and you'll fall back so that it gives you something reasonable even at the beginning. In the same way, progressive decentralization basically says, okay, let's bootstrap or start with a centralized or semi-centralized system, and then have a roadmap to progressively decentralize aspects. And towards the end, where it's full decentralization, you have a here be dragons, where people recognize that it may not be feasible to get there, but maybe you might be able to use pieces of the system to then get to the next one.
Thanks. Elizabeth, what are your thoughts on, we come from,
no
thoughts
problem.
on the biggest challenge and the biggest
I'm actually just going to quickly comment. So on the question of ICOs, since I know that's a really hot topic, I will say that I am an ICO skeptic. I'm not inherently against the idea of being able to raise capital in other ways, but right now what we've seen is a whole lot of projects, very few of whom have a lot of substance, that are raising way too much money at very high valuations. It's kind of like Silicon Valley Season 2, Episode 1, if anybody's ever seen it, when the guy's like, wait, what? I didn't have to raise that much money at that high of a valuation? I do think we'll see interesting, so people heard about what happened with the SEC. Now, ways to potentially do it legally. I think we'll have to see way more reasonable valuations. So there is potential there, but in its current state, for example, there was an ICO that actually just copied the Lightning white paper and raised like $80 million worth of ETH. So yeah.
Really?
Yeah, actually, yes. I've had friends say they get 9 proposals per day of white papers that just don't make any sense. So there's a crazy frenzy going on right now, and the valuations are incredibly high. Very quickly, to get to your questions, in terms of opportunity, I do think, the current global climate, there's a lot of uncertainty there, and, for better or for worse, I do think that does mean we need a global, internet store of value, and this is going to continue to be highly valuable. And right now we're in 1995 when it comes to the blockchains. I mentioned that earlier in my talk in terms of the development of this technology. I do believe something like Lightning and Layer 2 with Blockstack can really bring us forward. And really get to the use cases where real people can use it. The drawbacks is actually, it's still hard to use. Think about sending PGP email. That is hard. There's some study that it took MIT CS students 30 minutes just to figure out how to set up PGP. Similarly, sending Bitcoin, how many people here think sending Bitcoin is easy? Okay. Not that many, right? So we can really improve the user experience on a lot of these technologies, and there's a lot of work left to be done. So I would say that that is a major drawback. And then also the intersection between security and usability. Because something can be really secure and super hard to use, or it could be really easy and then you could have your coin stolen easily. So we need to strike that balance.
Great points.
I was just going to remark one thing. I do think there is a distinction between tokenization and ICOs in the sense of, for example, Bitcoin was arguably tokenized using today's parlance, but there's no ICO. And I think you could also do something with, for example, a number of these private blockchain consortiums. You could tokenize it such that the internal token was split between the parties for kind of developing it, but there's no public ICO, for example. So they're related, but not exactly the same. Just
Cool.
So I guess I'll say I agree with both Elizabeth and Balaji, although they said quite different things. There's definitely truth in both of them. I like Elizabeth, I'm definitely a skeptic, in the sense that there are obviously lots of scams. There are lots of projects, even if they're not scams, but they're never going to build what they're promising, and it's never going to work the way they say it is. So I think a lot of the now some of them I think might last, some of them might work. Most of them won't. That's also true for businesses in general. It's true for startup companies and things, really small businesses. They often fail and so on. So that's not necessarily different. But I am still definitely a skeptic of most of the actual projects. That said, I still agree with Balaji that actually it does. I would say it doesn't matter, and I think that tokens are going to continue to actually drive the space forward for the foreseeable future. Anyway, it doesn't matter if most of them are scams. If you have one project in 100 that actually does what they're delivering on or what they're promising to deliver on, they're promising a lot. So you don't need a whole lot of those to drive the whole space forward. And with respect to it also depends on what you mean by driving the space forward. tokens are going to raise the price of everything. We're going to keep seeing rising prices of cryptocurrencies, I think, indefinitely. I'm not saying there won't be a crash.
We're going to get to 1999 at one point, I think.
Yeah. Well, we will, and we're not there yet, but we will get to 1999 at some point. But I think for now, I don't think we're there yet, and I think we're going to keep seeing rising prices. But I also do want to pitch that from a different point of view. I do actually believe payments can and will also help drive the space forward. The difference is payments, it's not going to increase the price of cryptocurrencies, because when you use cryptocurrencies for payments, you get in and you get out. Our users want fiat currency. They don't care about cryptocurrency. They're not in this for speculation. They just want to either sell an article for 10 cents or buy an article for 10 cents. So that will drive the usage of the space forward, but we're going to still see a lot of hype around tokens and all that stuff. On the other flip side of it, the challenges, look, there are two challenges. Maybe three. I would say technical is extremely important, and when I say that, I'm talking primarily actually how to actually use the technology to build products, which is extremely difficult right now. So that's really important. And number two is regulatory. Although I think the regulatory one, as we're already seeing, is actually not going to be that much of a problem, because what's actually going to happen is people are going to leave the countries that kind of suck, and they're going to go to the countries that are all right. So I'm not actually sure that regulatory is that big of a problem. It's a problem for the US.
And it's a problem if you're a Russian in Greece who had an exchange recently.
Let's end on that note. I have a lot more questions that I'd love to ask, but this was fascinating. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.